Hello and welcome to WightWanderer. I'm Jack and you join me today on top of St Boniface Down, overlooking Ventnor and of course the chalk pit where Ventnor Railway Station was once located until it closed in 1966. Now I've been up here twice already this year, either talking about ghost stations or the issues Ventnor currently faces with land movement. But no matter the subject, there is always one central issue. There's the station, or what's left of it, there is the town, and between it is a rather grueling climb. One arduous enough back in the day to actually deter passengers from using the railway itself, which essentially led to its decline and closure. Even nowadays, proposals to reinstate the railway are usually met with the same old opposition choir chanting, "What about the hill?" But did you know that the whole debate, the entire affair itself, was almost solved by the Victorians over 100 years ago?
Now, Isle of Wight railway boffins and regular viewers of the channel should be by now fairly familiar with the history of Ventnor's railway connections. But for newcomers to the channel, here's a quick catch-up. Ventnor was once the southern terminus of the Isle of Wight Railway, formerly known as the Isle of Wight Eastern Section Railway, and opened to traffic in 1866. The Isle of Wight Railway knew straight away that the location of their Ventnor Station, perched high above the town in a chalk pit, was far from ideal. But they had to compromise as local landowners refused to let them build their railway around the coast like they wanted to. They did attempt to solve the issue early on by planning to extend the railway via a second tunnel emerging at a station along Bonchurch Road. The extension, though, for two reasons, never got past the design stage. Firstly, the planned terminus at Bonchurch Road wouldn't have actually been much closer to the town anyway. And secondly, plans were already in the bag for an entirely separate railway system connecting their existing station to the town.
In as early as 1863, 3 years before the station even opened, a man by the name of Richard Saunders formed the Ventnor Tramway Company. And 1 year later, his plans for a network of tram lines came to light, interconnecting the different districts of Ventnor with the station itself. Now, the diagram is nowhere near descriptive enough to be able to trace where the lines would have ran. But essentially his idea to combat the drop was to run the lines first east and west to different districts before doubling back on themselves to the town centre.
Descending the slope in stages would basically have the effect of easing the gradient over a greater distance. The plan, though, had a major flaw. The easing of the gradient meant that visitors would first have to travel out to a completely different district of Ventnor before doubling back and actually getting to the town centre where most of them wanted to be. On top of that, the locals just didn't like the idea. Therefore, in 1865, much to the frustration of Mr. Saunders, the Ventnor Tramway Bill was scrapped. Around this time, Ventnor was becoming a major tourist hotspot, and the central attractor was the viewpoint from St Boniface Down itself. Therefore, the local council were adamant that a self-contained railway system for Ventnor had to also include a connection to the top of the hill.
Now, St Boniface Down is about 241 metres above sea level, and let's say the point at which I'm standing right now is about 200 metres. Nice round number there. The distance between me and the shore right now is about 400 metres, as near as makes no difference. That means that the drop down to sea level from here is about half the breadth between me and the shore. Now, that wouldn't be surprising if I was stood on the edge of a cliff, but between me and it is an entire town. Ventnor really is built on the geological equivalent of a Big Dipper. So how on earth do you build a railway from this point up here to down there? Well, oddly, a Big Dipper ain't that far off.
Enter the Funicular Railway, a system designed to tackle steep gradients using a cable or belt to which carriages would be attached and hauled up an incline. Kind of like a Big Dipper then, just slower and not as nerve-wracking. Less Alton Towers and more Stannah stairlift.
Incidentally, the first funicular railway to be proposed in Ventnor was actually called the Ventnor Lift, and it came to light in 1889. The plan was to run a line from the top near the station down the hill to the Esplanade. And to counteract all the buildings and streets in the way, it would be built almost entirely within a tunnel. It was a novel idea, but far from practical, and above all, dangerous, especially given the issues that Ventnor has faced recently with land movement. The term buried alive comes to mind.
On top of that, the plan didn't even contain a connection to the top of St Boniface, like the locals had demanded. So the proposal went nowhere. But importantly, the idea stuck. And soon various plans for funicular railways in Ventnor started coming thick and fast.
The first solid proposal materialised in 1897 when the Ventnor Inclines Light Railway Company was founded, and they put forward plans to connect the Esplanade, the town, the station and the down itself all together, so very ambitious then. And thanks to our old friends Maycock and Salisbury, we actually have a rough description of where the line would have ran. So the first section was to begin at a station on the Esplanade opposite the pier, which sadly for us was demolished in 1993 following a fire. But I am stood roughly on the alignment of where the pier would have stood, and according to the book, the station would have been in the garden of one of those properties over there. It then ran north up the hill under Hamborough Road and various properties on Church Street, presumably via tunnel or cutting, emerging at a central station, which, judging by the lay of the land, would have likely been situated in the area of Marlborough Road. From there, the line would have climbed up a diagonal viaduct, presumably over Grove Road and then underneath Mitchell Avenue, which was then called Newport Road. It would then have emerged in the station yard. So that was the first section, but the second one up to the top of the down was a bit odd because it actually started at right angles to the other section, which makes me think it was possibly planned to be an entirely different railway altogether. From the station yard, the railway would have ascended St Boniface Down on the eastern side of the chalk pit, climbing 342 feet to the summit. So that sounds great then. Why wasn't it built?
Well, for a while at least, it all looked very promising. The plan was actually encouraged by the Urban District Council and the Isle of Wight Railway Company, the latter actually promising to pledge £5,000 towards the cost of construction. In 1899, the Board of Trade granted a light railway order for the line, but not for the entire length. Plans for the section from the station up to the down were still unsupported due to that old railway nemesis, the local landowner. This landowner would turn out to be a poison dart for the Ventnor Inclined Light Railway Company. And in 1903, despite the Isle of Wight Railway's initial support in promising £5,000 to the construction, the actual pledged capital in the piggy bank was a dismal £7. Naturally then, that was the end of that. But dreams of a funicular railway in Ventnor weren't going to be forgotten that easily.
Next stop 1908, and an engineer called Fritz Bernard Burr, who just so happened to live in Ventnor at the time, was commissioned by the local council to build a brand new funicular railway. Now, Burr was by no means an upstart. In fact, you could call him the father of the monorail, building the Listowel Ballybunion Railway in Ireland, an odd system using a single rail with locomotives seemingly balanced on a trestle. Burr, though, also had funicular experience as he constructed the Funicular du Tréport in France. So clearly he was the man for the job.
Burr got to work right away, designing a railway once again from the Esplanade up to the station, and then continuing to the top of the hill. The section from the railway yard to the summit was planned to take somewhat of a different route to the previous proposal. making use of the natural dip in the landscape before scaling a much steeper climb to the top. As for the section from the station down to the seafront, it would have descended at an average of 1 in 5 under Mitchell Avenue, to a first intermediate station at Grove Road.
Presumably then about here. The line then ducked under Grove Road itself and made its way down to Church Street over there, where a central station was to be built. That central station would have been about here, where the foundations of the Rex Hotel now stands. Incidentally, right next to the rockfall, which happened earlier this year, which still hasn't been cleared up yet, but I digress. From here, the line would have sloped sharply downwards to the back of the Esplanade Hotel, which, much like the Pier, succumbed to a fiery end quite early on.
The Esplanade Hotel, later called the Beach Hotel, was located about where these apartments now stand, and the station was planned to be accessible via the front entrance. Certainly good business then for the hotel.
Once again then, sounds great, and with a town hall public meeting in December 1908 coming out overwhelmingly in favour of the scheme, what could go wrong?
Well, that's the question. You see, it's hard to tell. In 1909, the council asked to postpone the bill. Assumedly, discussions between the Board of Trade and landowners once again broke down. Exactly why they broke down though, your guess is as good as mine.
You would think by now then that cold feet were being felt, but evidently no. Because over the preceding years, a multitude of proposals actually came to light, including one proposing an electric street tramway from the Esplanade all the way up to Lalverville at the top of Ventnor. However, none shall pass, much to the dismay of the Victorian holidaymakers and their heavy hampers.
In 1913, motor buses began running throughout Ventnor, and they were an instant hit with the locals. Both this development and the outbreak of war in 1914 seemingly spelt the end for the ambitious engineers and their funicular dreams.
That then would appear to be that, but just like a Lynyrd Skynyrd track, when you think it's all over, there's always one last solo. Back up the hill we go then.
You see, in 1922, following the death of the local landowner who put the kibosh on one of the earlier proposals, the area of St Boniface Down fell into the hands of the National Trust, and they, on the whole, were much more willing to negotiate. Initially, a scheme to build an elevator up the down was floated about, with ambitions, if that's the word, of it being passed through the books as a war memorial. Naturally, the scheme was seen straight away for what it was, an affront to the memories of fallen war heroes. This, though, didn't deter the Southern Railway from having a go, who, after railway grouping in 1923, were now in charge of the island's railway network. The new proposal was basically a fusion of previous plans, but this time the line at the station would have started on the western side of the yard, the only covered section being immediately diving under Ocean View Road.
The line would have descended underneath Mitchell Avenue and followed the western side of Grove Road down to the church. And from there it would have followed the 1909 plan down to the Esplanade Hotel. The Southern were serious about this. They even bought up many of the buildings on the alignment ready to be flattened and redeveloped. Nothing could stand in their way.
Well, as you can tell, something did. And that something was the public. The locals by now had become accustomed to their motor buses. And after 30 years of attempts to build a funicular, the idea had become a bit of a joke around the town. The world had moved on, and after the project manager's retirement in 1927, the Southern and Ventnor itself decided to finally abandon any hopes of a funicular railway to the town.
As time went on then, Ventnor Station continued to be a geographical headache for the network. That was of course until the 18th of April 1966, where the station and the railway itself completely disappeared, leaving Ventnor without any kind of rail connection. Fast forward to the present day, and many still argue, including yours truly, for the reinstatement of the railway to Ventnor. But the point of contention still remains: steep hill. And yet the Victorians had the answer all those years ago. And who knows, if they'd succeeded, perhaps the railway itself would have also survived. And we would be looking down right now at a completely different scene of happy families with happy faces disembarking the train, ready to experience the crisp sea air of Ventnor, just like their ancestors did all those years ago. Thank you for watching.